many people here were involved in working on the P3 campaigns that we have done around Ontario? So some of you are very, very familiar with these. And in total now, I think we've had 130,000 people in Ontario in local plebiscites vote against P3 privatization of their local hospitals. And as a result of that, in Ontario, in the P3 hospitals, the amount of privatization has been shrunk. So in the first deals in Brampton, about half the hospital was privatized. About 400 of the workers in the Brampton Hospital, for example, half of the hospital budget, operating budget, as well as obviously the real estate deal on the land and all of that stuff. In the new P3 deals, after Brampton and Ottawa, about less than 10 of the jobs are privatized. That just sort of gives you a sense of the rollback in terms of operational privatization of the hospitals. But all of the other stuff remains, the high costs, the land deals, all of the other commercial deals, and an expansion clause in the templates, in the agreements for the P3 hospitals that allows the private sector partner, so-called partner, to make proposals to the hospital board for ever more privatization projects within the hospital and on the lands for the duration of the project. And in at least some of those deals, the hospital board is not able to unreasonably withhold their approval of those. So, so they have this kind of ticking time bomb in them, even the ones that we've rolled back, wherein they can, expand the privatization. Anyway, the government in Ontario now has, what, $50-some-odd billion infrastructure program. And you can bet they're going to do almost all of that through P3's. And so as our board really felt that it was important that we take on this fight again in a significant way. And so Heather is a real expert in this. And what's neat about her is that she also has expertise. Her sort of areas of research are fiscal austerity, that we talked about yesterday, capitalist crisis, and neoliberal state restructuring. All of those are kind of fancy academic words for exactly what we talked about all day yesterday. And she's going to be an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, you folks over there. And she has written a couple of books. Her most recent one is called Private Affluence, Public Austerity, Economic Crisis, and Democratic Malaise in Canada. So welcome, Heather, thanks for coming. Okay, thanks so much for that introduction and some background explanation on P3's, which I'll also go into a little bit as well. I just want to say how happy I am to be invited here to speak about public-private partnerships, or P3's, PPP, PFI, sometimes they're called in the UK, which are, of course, yet another example of for-profit involvement in our public healthcare system. I've been doing P3 research of various kinds for a number of years now, almost a decade, beginning with Highway 407 here in Ontario, and other transportation P3's, and then more recently on hospitals in BC and Ontario, and then the political economy of public-private partnerships more generally. So the relationship to fiscal austerity is important and almost intrinsic in a way, first in the 90s when they emerged, and then later now in the kind of post-crisis context. And I'll go into that in a little bit. But I guess I just want to emphasize that these P3's aren't new, nor are they unique to hospitals or Canada even, but there are some specific problems that crop up in this sector and that are unique to today, to the austerity context today. So I'll be taking a sort of macro overview look at the public-private partnership phenomenon, both before and after the 2008 global economic crisis, particularly hospitals in Ontario and the public response in the austerity context. So back in 2001, you may recognize some of these names, then Health Minister of Ontario, Tony Clement, promised that bringing for-profit partners into the public healthcare system, the provincial public healthcare system, would mean, quote, these are from newspaper quotes, quote, better, faster, and cheaper hospitals. In that same year, then Finance Minister of Ontario, Jim Flaherty, said that the building there, he was speaking of the Royal Ottawa Hospital, will get built more quickly and sooner and more effectively and efficiently than if it were done solely within the public sector. And he wanted this to be an expansive policy, so it would be used from hospitals to hockey rinks, if you can imagine that. These claims were ideologically driven, clearly, at the time, and misleading at best when they were made. But it's actually much more, it's much easier now, over a decade later, with P3 use in full swing in BC, Ontario, and other provinces, to really see how the P3 model has functioned. And far from being better, faster, or cheaper, the infrastructure is often less innovative. It's delayed, despite it being claims to be on time and on budget. It's more costly, it's more risky. It actually inscribes risk into infrastructure that didn't previously contain those risks. And it's then clearly no solution to the need for new and improved hospital infrastructure in Canada. So just starting with a bit of background. P3's first began to emerge, as I mentioned, in the 1990s in this country, and this was in a range of sectors. There's now over 200 operational P3s across Canada, so not just in healthcare. But because the areas that are most amenable to the P3 model in infrastructure fall within provincial jurisdiction, like hospitals, highways, and bridges, P3 use in this country is really required, and so why my research is focused on BC and Ontario, the support of a provincial government that's encouraging of this model and this form of privatization. So the BC and Ontario Liberal governments since the early 2000s have really proven to be leaders then in P3 development. And now these numbers, it changes over time, the proportion of hospitals to the rest of other infrastructure projects that are P3s, but P3 hospitals now make up a very significant portion of total P3 development in BC and Ontario. So it's 3/4 of all P3s in BC and half in Ontario. And the other major sector is transportation. So there's currently 15 hospitals and healthcare projects in British Columbia that are in various stages of development, so ranging from in procurement to fully operational, and 40 in Ontario. So this is really a big part of the P3 story in Canada, and it means that P3s are the way that new major hospital infrastructure is being developed in this country. I just want to, just for those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with the model, I just want to explain exactly how it works. So this is an arrangement where a private for-profit partner, which is usually a multinational consortia, is contracted for 30 years, or in some cases more, but usually in the health sector it's 30 years or so, to privately design, build, and finance and operate to various extent the operation of the public infrastructure, like a hospital, highway, or school. And so then the support service portion, as Natalie was mentioning, can vary. In hospitals, this would be something like maintenance, IT, security, perhaps food as well. And so then by opening up these public infrastructure and services to private for-profit investment, P3s really are a unique form of privatization. And this is because public-private partnership, public-private collaboration rather, has existed for centuries. But what the P3 model does is it sells risk. It creates risk and then it sells risk through these kind of complex, bundled contracts that last for many decades. So even if the asset that's created, the hospital, is owned technically by the public partner and then operated by the private partner, there's always this public sector obligation that's involved. And this is where the true cost, the total cost, and I'll go into that a little bit later in the austerity context, matters, since profit is siphoned off, but all costs remain with the public partner ultimately. So just going into a little bit of the claims versus reality. These P3s are often used by politicians as a way of meeting election promises. So you promise a hospital, and you're also not going to increase taxes at the same time, and so then you can deliver the hospital or upgrade public infrastructure without increasing taxes, without repealing balanced budget legislation, or changing other forms of cost control. So this is why P3s have sort of always coexisted with a type of austerity context, where they're really this kind of build now, pay later solution to public sector spending restraint. But if you look at the empirical record, as I was saying, they've been around for quite a while now, so it's increasingly easy to judge this. They're actually costlier, and they generate their own risks and drawbacks.
The major economic costs, of course, come through the higher interest rates that private partners pay, as compared to what a public sector partner can secure through interest rates. But it also comes through the profit motive, of course, and problems with risk transfer, and then there's this sort of problematic evaluation methodology. There's also social costs, of course, which are of high concern in the healthcare sector, like poor quality services perhaps, more precarious working conditions for staff, and then an overall erosion of democratic control and decision-making in areas that are quite clearly vital to the public interest. Next slide. Thanks. So, in light of these sort of long-standing, really multi-decade in a sense, problems with the P3 model, there's been a real dogged commitment that's been shown to this form of privatization, particularly in a sensitive area like healthcare. And what this has meant is not just pushing through more and more projects, but actually some pretty significant, but covert, in a sense, policy change, which has aimed to, I would argue, depoliticize and normalize P3s in the healthcare sector. And this began, as you note, the dates there on the slides, after these Liberal election victories in BC in 2001 and Ontario in 2003. So I don't know how well you can see this slide, but there's different items in what might be called these kind of enabling fields. It's not just one policy. And they're really a set of interlocking developments that operate in different ways to really facilitate or encourage, or in some cases, compel P3s. And I'm calling them a field here because these items apply across the public sector. So just to mention a few items that are listed. For instance, the capital planning and public infrastructure spending procedures that have now been in place, using Ontario as an example, since 2004, force ministries and local authorities to explain not only, to sort of not just justify P3s, but to actually explain why P3s are not justified. And these rules are applied to projects that cost more than 20 million, which is essentially all they cost, federal development. And this threshold then is set very low. In addition, healthcare authorities now operate under these budgetary and capital planning procedures in BC and Ontario, where essentially these rules favor privatization. I mean, I don't want to go into too many details, but these are really the policies that have been in place for now over a decade. And finally, with the P3 units, these are really important as well. So this is Infrastructure Ontario and Partnerships BC. These are quasi-independent. They have highly paid staff, often cherry-picked from the private sector, and they're charged with promoting, evaluating, and developing projects. And then in Ontario, of course, it also involved rebranding P3 as AFP, Alternative Financing and Procurement, but of course these projects are P3s. So I just want to emphasize with these enabling field components, they essentially provide that in difficult times like the global financial crisis, which I'll go into in 1 second, means that the policies weren't abandoned or even changed, but just sort of kept rolling. So with the crisis then, just to show you some examples of what's going wrong. This is in addition to the usual problems with P3 hospitals, of course, is more expensive private financing, first of all. So between 2007 and 2009, the interest rate spread, so the difference between what a public partner can secure and private partner on average increased from 2% to 3 or 4%. And over the lifetime then of a project, that means that private financing costs roughly 70% more in present value terms. And this holds even with interest rates having been so low since the Great Recession of 2009. This on top of other financial market difficulties created delays and cancellations and financing difficulties, and I give some examples there of delays in financing difficulties. In BC, there was the Fort St. John Hospital P3 project where a new private financing partner had to be brought in and bailed out. This was a $268 million project. In Ontario, the Niagara Health Systems P3 was delayed for months as well. So it made me look like for a short time anyway, these kind of market forces might be enough alone to sort of push out the P3 model. But then there's this countervailing force that emerges, and that's the new austerity context. So I'm going to use some examples from Ontario specifically to show that how the austerity context is really institutionalized with private partnerships in healthcare. But just keeping in mind though that they did emerge initially in the 90s under this kind of first wave of austerity where health transfers were slashed as well. So using the 2012 Ontario budget, for example, the budget cut program spending by 17.7 billion over 3 years, but at the same time in that identical budget, it commits to 30 new hospital projects using exclusively the P3 model and 25 that are currently under construction. The budget uses specifically 4 hospital projects as examples of this kind of P3 value for money superiority. And so I list them there. This is exactly what's the numbers that are provided in the budget. Mississauga, supposedly a value for money savings of 26 million. This is a savings in comparison to the public option, supposedly. London, 50 million, North Bay, 57, and Belleville, 9 million. But these value for money claims aren't based on any kind of actual dollars that will be saved. They're based on what's called risk transfer. So this is extremely misleading for many reasons. Of course, the major one being that when the private partner builds risks into their bids, so they're compensated for these risks. And also this assumes that these risks couldn't be transferred under traditional design-build type contracts. So in this next slide, so I put this together, sort of cobbled it together using different value for money documents that have been published by Infrastructure Ontario previously. So this was in 2007 and 2008, using these exact same hospitals' value for money documents. And when you take this risk transfer component out, you see what the base costs are construction, maintenance, and financing, just how significant the difference is. So the difference column indicates how the base costs would there would be a greater savings for the public if the traditional public model had gone through. So Mississauga, it's 10.5 million, sorry. North Bay, for example, is almost 150 million, and so on. So this means that not only are these sort of private for-profit interests benefiting through P3's during the time of austerity, but also this is a clear loss of money for the public and may translate into less available for services and public infrastructure in the future. Okay, so that's how it works for provinces that are enthusiastic for P3 deals. But for the federal government, I'll show on the next slide, thanks. The federal government has also been working really hard to push P3s, and this isn't specific to healthcare, but just to sort of push this model across the country, particularly in this austerity context. And this applies mainly to the municipal level infrastructure, and provinces that might be more reluctant or less enthusiastic for P3s. So, for instance, here are just some examples. The Harper government created the Crown Corporation P3 Canada in 2007, and this Crown Corporation then promotes, supports, and helps to fund P3s that are developed, exclusively P3s that are developed across the country. And this applies then in provincial jurisdictions that don't have an Infrastructure Ontario or Partnerships BC, and municipalities that want or need the financial and technical assistance to develop P3s. Now, looking at some austerity budgets, in 2012, the federal government budget cut 5.2 billion, and at the same time, the P3 Canada Fund received dedicated commitments of 2.8 billion, and then again in 2013 of 1.25 billion. So these aren't insignificant sums by any stretch. And then in 2014, more recently, the new Building Canada Fund is worth 14 billion over 10 years, and it has a P3 screen that's going to be applied to all proposals that exceed $100 million. So this means, in many ways, just extending beyond healthcare, that P3s are in some ways the kind of only game in town for particularly municipal governments that are in need of infrastructure renewal during a time of austerity. So looking to the future then, one of the great ironies of public-private partnerships are that they're being justified today and in the past as better value for money suited for a time of fiscal restraint, but they're going to inevitably undermine the ability to cut future budgets, since the public sector is contractually obligated to these more expensive privately provided services and infrastructure. And again, these are contracts that are 30 years, 40, 50, with Highway 407, it's 99 years. There have been, in the UK where the P3 model has been used more extensively and for a sort of longer amount of time, there's all these scandals that are starting to emerge with their P3 or PFI hospitals. So this is related to these astronomical fees and hyperinflated charges like £75 for an air freshener, £466 to replace a light fixture, and so on, other examples that have been released through Freedom of Information. And this is then leaving these public partners, these NHS trusts, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and in some cases technically bankrupt. Like in 2012, South London Healthcare NHS Trust was technically bankrupt. And another 30 then are, quote, unviable in their current form, and this all has to do with these really expensive P3 deals. So this then might help, this locking in these expensive P3 deals here in Canada as well could help promote privatization in other areas of public health care, since the infrastructure then, I think I might mention this later, but the infrastructure comes out of the provincial budget, but the service component comes out of the local agency's budget. So they may need to turn to other forms of revenue generation in the future. I think that this UK track record then, since it is more developed, should really serve as a cautionary tale here in Canada to what might happen in the future, and it hopefully would discourage the proliferation of P3s here. But we don't see their use slowing down at all, and rather they're being institutionalized under this austerity context. Okay, so my final, so how do we get rid of these things? I guess that's maybe the main question. I think the next session is going to be talking about resistance, and so obviously resistance to privatization in general, those types of strategies would apply with P3s, but I just wanted to mention two kind of major concerns with P3 hospitals that need to be addressed in order to create viable solutions. I think that, okay, so there's no doubt that greater public money is needed for healthcare. I think it can come through traditional financing, definitely in traditional public sector budgeting, but I really do think that some new solutions are needed to counter this easy appeal of private financing. So Hugh McKinsey suggested in 2007 a great solution, that's risk pooling. In a way, this is kind of what the P3 model purports to do, but we can do this in the public sector and save a lot more money. Another suggestion by CUPE and the CCPA is the development of a federal public asset fund. A third might be the use of public bonds to finance hospital infrastructure. Of course, bond financing has its own drawbacks, and we have to look at each of these, examples and kind of tweak them. But the main thing is that countering this kind of cheap and easy appeal to what's actually more expensive and more difficult in the long run through the use of private financing. And whatever the solution is on the financing front, public sector pensions should not be investing in public-private partnerships which undermine their own jobs and the public sector. And I think greater politicization is needed overall, and not just the projects, but the policies themselves. Of course, targeting the projects is crucial, but it's this kind of web of institutionalized policy support that takes the politics. I mean, obviously they're intrinsically political, but it takes that high-level decision-making out of it and makes it a routine procedure for ministries and local authorities. So this depoliticization is most evident even in the Ontario 2014 budget, where this Moving Ontario Forward 10-year infrastructure strategy, if you go to the Infrastructure Ontario website, these are almost all P3s, but they don't even call them P3s or AFP anymore, they're just infrastructure. So I think that really, whether it's sort of good times or bad times economically, P3s are going to have the same long-run implications, and that's higher costs, more precarious and casualized employment, less union capacity, fractured bargaining units, and this kind of market-oriented public sector that really encourages the participation of for-profit actors in myriad ways in the public healthcare sector. Okay, so this makes resistance then, of course, all the more important today and for the future. Thank you.